Wait a minute, you. I've heard about people like you. Are you saying you don't believe in Santa Claus?
Oh, please.
Definitely not. Yeah, definitely not.
Exactly, yes.
And you call yourselves superheroes?
Well, I can see we won't be settling this over eggnog, but here's something we can all agree on. It's time to go caroling!
The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. I'm not sure how I managed to not grow up on this movie. I remember seeing bits and pieces on TV and more of the 1994 remake, but all I remembered before I watched it for review was the basic premise. Santa Claus is put on trial because nobody believes it's really him. I finally saw it last weekend when the theater I go to happened to be showing it, which marks the first time I've gone to a movie theater to see something for a rewind review. And incidentally, I think this is also the oldest movie I've ever reviewed. I sure wish now that I had grown up with this movie, and now that I've seen the whole thing, I plan to show it to my kids every year. If there's a movie that better encapsulates what Christmas and Santa Claus should be all about, and that has a more genuine, believable Santa Claus performance, please let me know about it, because Edmund Gwenn more than deserved his Best Supporting Actor Oscar for that role. His character makes nearly everyone in the film believe he's the real deal, or at least makes them want to enough that he's declared the legal Santa Claus in a court of law. He made the actors on set believe he's really Santa Claus, and he made me believe it to the point that I half expected him to fly over Doris and Susan at the end, dropping presents from his sleigh in the sky. I'm so glad it ultimately never goes there, but still manages to be ambiguous enough that if you wanted to tell me you think he might still be the genuine article, I'd have a tough time arguing with you. And really, that's not the point at all. As Kris Kringle says, Christmas isn't just a day, it's a state of mind. And the man in this film so perfectly embodies that idea that he deserves the definition of Santa Claus to include him as its real-life personification as much as Data deserves the definition of life to be extended to include him in the Star Trek The Next Generation episode The Measure of a Man. It's sentimental, it's a feel-good movie, and yes, it's one of an umpteen number of movies about the true meaning of Christmas. But it's not sappy about it. It's not a PSA. It doesn't draw a lot of easily changed one-dimensional characters who get the message on a dime so the kids in the audience will get the point. It's a real story about characters who come alive and feel like real people. And when it does feel the need to come right out and drive home a message, faith is believing even when common sense tells you not to, it's always in the context of these characters expressing their own worldviews, and in the context of what is appropriate to teach a child. So the very themes of the movie are being discussed by the players in the drama and in a natural way, rather than a thinly veiled and hollow moral lesson directed more at me and past the other characters in the room. At the end of the movie, the mother, after all the miracles she's seen, is still given a choice to embrace Kringle and Gailey's ideals or to discard them, and I feel I'm given the same choice. This movie that's all about how relative and arbitrary the idea of realism is surprisingly realistic. It's not set in a stylistic or fairy tale world. It's set in our world, and it's totally authentic, going as far as to using real-world big business juggernauts in its commentary about the commercialism of Christmas, Macy's and Gimbel's. It doesn't deliver the standard and generic anything is possible message, but rather presents that overused, and probably overused even at the time, platitude as a well-reasoned argument against apathy and cynicism. Kris Kringle isn't the actual Santa Claus because he's from the North Pole and flies around with reindeer and can somehow magically deliver toys to every child in the world in a single evening. He's the real Santa Claus because he fully embodies what that character stands for, and nobody else seems capable of that. And a lot like Captain America or Superman, he sets an example for a vast majority of people with a fatalistic mindset who feel trapped by the cutthroat realities of society, that in order to get ahead, you have to do so at the expense of and by taking advantage of others. Kris Kringle proves Rachel Dawes' motto in Batman Begins. It's not who you are underneath, but what you do that defines you. By constantly giving freely of himself, spreading joy and cheer everywhere he goes, and insisting he's Santa Claus, he becomes that character. His extreme and dramatic example rubs off on everyone around him. Many of them come to embrace his goodwill philosophy and find that it's more rewarding on a personal and professional level than their every man for himself philosophy. It's a movie about faith, but not faith in a god really, more faith in people, although an argument for religious belief could perhaps be made with this movie that whether anyone else thinks someone's god exists or not, the very belief in that entity is what drives some people to be the best versions of themselves. I won't get any further into that side of it, but I appreciate that it's not a heavy-handed, thinly veiled church sermon. Kringle believes himself to be Santa Claus because he wants the world to be better, and he believes it can be. He believes in other people, not just in himself, and so he sets the example because he thinks he can show people that compassion and giving and compromise is not only the right thing to do, but the more practical and sustainable way to live, as Gailey implies, who is the one person who believes in Kringle and has a similar mindset already, when he tells Doris that her realistic idea of getting ahead just doesn't work. I especially love that he has that mindset because he has the anachronistic occupation of lawyer. The point ultimately isn't that people believe Kringle is really Santa Claus, but that they come to believe in something else they thought impossible, that the world can go on spinning and society won't crumble and actually functions better when everyone does what's best for everyone else rather than just what's best for themselves. That perhaps just the way it is an excuse to take advantage of people rather than a reason you have to. Miracle on 34th Street is a timeless movie that reminds us just how little things have changed in over half a century. And it's a delightful, simple, hilarious, and charming film that has a lot to say about the importance of faith, myth, and imagination. And it's perhaps the smartest and most sharp-witted movie attempting to articulate that to give is better to receive Christmas philosophy I've seen. One of the reasons I think this movie is so successful is that it's clear from script to screen that this was a labor of love on the part of everyone involved. Everything about the attitude of the film itself is the attitude of Kris Kringle. It's certainly more complicated than this, but like Kris Kringle is Santa Claus because he believes he is, it's almost like this movie was a monstrous success and became a timeless classic because that's precisely what it perceives itself as, and not in any kind of self-indulgent or presumptuous way. Screenwriter Valentine Davies is clearly writing from the heart. According to the AMC Backstory episode on this film, Davies was appalled by the mad retail rush on Christmas Eve when he needed to find a present at the last minute, and was inspired to write a movie dealing with the over-commercialization of Christmas, sparked by the fleeting notion of what Santa Claus might think if he saw what Davies saw. His approach in writing about the world he lived in versus what he wished it could be, I think, is what makes it resonate so much with people. Director George Seaton went all the way to not only using the real major retailers as in the script, which is really risky and unusual even now, but even film on location at the 1946 Macy's Thanksgiving Parade and inside the Macy's store. That was an especially risky move with this project because both Macy and Gimbel allegedly, again according to that AMC documentary, refused to sign off on the movie until they had seen it separately at completion, which meant that if either failed to approve it, costly reshoots and re-edits would have to be made, and who knows if it wouldn't have turned into a hobbled-together mess. Luckily, they both loved it and were all too happy to be associated with it, somewhat surprisingly to me, given that they're both in the movie portrayed as money grubbers who do the right thing, not because their hearts grow from being 3 sizes too small, but because they see that it's good for business, and their attitude is still one of shrewd competition and business strategy. They embrace Kringle's philosophy in their business not because they believe in it, but because it works. And a couple sections of the store, including Kris Kringle's throne, were recreated on a soundstage for key scenes, but everything else is completely authentic. And so the movie has a bit of a documentary component to it. You're seeing what Christmas season really looked like at Macy's in 1946, and that really was Edmund Gwenn playing Santa Claus throughout the entire 46 parade. No one had any idea it was a well-renowned movie star until the papers reported on it the next day. There hadn't been much of that sort of location shooting prior to this, and I imagine that helped to really sell the situation, even when viewers had no idea that what they were seeing was real. It's the sort of project that's rare in how much the people working on it believed in it, and how uncannily the production reflected the ideas and the spirit of the film. Maureen O'Hara, the actress who plays the lead, Doris, was initially furious with Fox for ordering her to return to America after moving back to Ireland. Fox wasn't sure what to do with the film and originally saw it as more of a B-movie quality piece. So they cast O'Hara because she had been a reliable box office draw. After reading the script, she, like everyone else, instantly fell in love with it and was grateful to be a part of it. Incidentally, O'Hara just passed away this last October at 95 years old. The performances strike me as genuine as the environments, and a lot of that is due to Gwenn's convincing Kris Kringle, of course. An 8-year-old Natalie Wood, according to O'Hara, thought Gwenn was the real Santa Claus, and while she does a fantastic job portraying a skeptical little girl who acts exactly like her mother, you can also see her awe and delight watching the man, and that makes her turn by the end all the more believable. And the most fascinating bit of trivia for me is that what a lot of people consider the quintessential Christmas film was released in the summer. Apparently Fox thought that made sense because more people see movies in the summer, but then they decided they had to keep the fact it was a Christmas movie under wraps because they didn't think they could market a Christmas movie in July. So not one frame from the movie was shown in the trailer, and instead, the studio cryptically sold it as a movie for everyone. Trust us, it's awesome. We believe in it, and you should too. Have faith. Exactly the sentiment of the movie, and I'm sure totally unintentionally, its success speaks volumes about how well that sentiment spoke to its audience. One of the primary points of the movie is that the example Kringle sets should be observed all the time, and so this is a movie that should not only have wide appeal, but should speak to people no matter the time of the year. Movies were rarely in the theater in those days for more than a couple weeks. This one went all the way until Christmas. Suffice it to say, it's one of those lightning in a bottle movies. It's a really special piece, and it carries itself with the poise and confidence it should. Like Kris Kringle himself, that self-assuredness is half the battle in making an audience believe in it. It's a swift hour and a half, it's well-paced, and every scene and exchange feels necessary, and it's wonderfully dense, getting all of its character work done efficiently and often minimally without the film feeling rushed. I know just enough about each character for him or her to come totally alive, and I don't even realize while I'm watching it how little I really do know about anyone. Exposition and dialogue is handled deftly, and I know all I need to in order to care about what happens to these people. No matter how much screen time a character gets, they're all sympathetic. Even if I don't like someone, like Sawyer, I'm given just enough to buy that he's developed into the person he is because of circumstance, experience, and life choices. Sawyer's in denial about a terrible marriage, seems to let his wife walk all over him, and the only comfort he can find is in pretending to have a more prestigious job than he really has. Even the prosecutor at Kringle's trial is made into a real person, and I can't help but sympathize with him. He and the judge have that in common, although I like that the judge has a political angle with it as well. The prosecutor really likes Kringle and is comedically compelled to concede that Santa Claus is a real person because he can't go back on a lie he made to his son in court. He's not simply the butt of jokes or the much-hated yin to Kringle's yang, again that's Sawyer, he's just a guy doing his job and standing up for his own principles, just like Kringle is. Someone has to fill that role and speak for the state of New York, so he accepts the task regardless of how he feels about it or what anyone else might think. And though he does his job to the best of his ability, I think he's perhaps ultimately relieved when he loses. He reminds me a little of Riker, again in Measure of a Man, having to play the role of prosecutor against his friend and do his best. Kringle describes Doris and her 8-year-old daughter Susan as lost souls. Doris has developed a nearly stoic and untrusting attitude toward people because the one person she had complete faith in was an ex-husband who left her after his daughter was born and who we never see or hear any more about in the film. When Doris explains to Gailey, who ultimately is the man she's been waiting for and doesn't realize it and will help to restore her faith in humanity, the reason she doesn't raise Susan on fairy tales is because she doesn't want her daughter to be disappointed when Prince Charming doesn't show up. We know everything we need to know about her. She thought she had the perfect life. He took it with him when he left, and it doesn't matter what the circumstances were, because any adult can relate to that shattering disillusionment. Everyone has been let down by someone, and it's easy to replace that old idealism or naivety with world-weariness. The lesson Doris will have to learn is that the imagination she's denying her daughter is what's necessary to help create the sort of world she'd rather live in, but she's given up. I like that just like Gailey, she also has a job that's counter to her worldview. She runs the Macy's Day Parade, which is all about fantasy. It's just a job for her, when perhaps at one time she might have appreciated the whimsy. Now she doesn't even enjoy watching her own work come to life. I also appreciate that simplicity because we're mostly seeing these people from Kris Kringle's eyes, and when not from his, from Gailey's, who sort of functions as a younger encapsulation of Kringle's ideology, and who is proof in practice for Kringle that the world isn't beyond saving. Kringle and Gailey both have complete faith in humanity and hope in individuals, except for perhaps Sawyer, who is the absolute antithesis to what both men represent. But besides that guy, Kringle believes everyone to be capable of bettering themselves and doesn't see people as especially complicated. Bad things happen to people and bad people are out there, but they don't represent the whole, and so when they hurt you, you can't see that as an indication that the sky is falling. And so rather than getting deep into the dirt of Doris's failed marriage, we know only what Kringle needs to know. She got burned by one man, and now she's raising her daughter to see the world as a cold place she'll have to strategically navigate her way through rather than find the joy in it that Kringle finds. But importantly, and despite the fact that obviously he's the most mysterious character in the film, I mean almost Joker in the Dark Knight mysterious, Kringle is as human as the protagonist. He shows up out of nowhere to help. It is that classic story formula of the lost, weary hero who needs a stranger to happen upon her or him to remind her of who she is and help her find herself again. Often that's a magical wizard or sage or just a perfect can-do-no-wrong wisdom head who's charismatic and witty, but ultimately really just a plot device to facilitate the protagonist's character arc. Here, Kris Kringle is just as flawed as everyone else, and that makes it hard not to see him as another protagonist until the very end. The Oscars labeled Gwenn a supporting character, and I'm somewhat inclined to agree, as the meat of the story is the family who comes together thanks to Kringle's help, and he's presented more as the catalyst to get the story moving. On the other hand, he is the most fascinating character in the film, and why I'm focusing primarily on him here. He's also the character in the story who, again, besides Gailey, has a clear goal he's working toward from the very beginning, and he's constantly challenged in his quest for it. Kringle wants to prove to himself that his hope for the world is still warranted, that Christmas, and by extension maybe even human decency itself, hasn't been so deformed and perverted by over-commercialization that he can't do something to change it. He either bases his life on the principles of Santa Claus, or he really is Santa Claus, and it's important to him that he can positively affect people. It's his only purpose. So he decides to test his skills on Doris, a total skeptic who naturally dismisses him out of hand, though very politely and elegantly, when she reads his hysterical hiring slip that lists his next of kin as all of Santa's reindeer. Except for Rudolph. I guess Kringle's a traditionalist, at least going back as far as 1823, when The Night Before Christmas was written, which is where those names were originally cited. Poor Rudolph. I bet the other reindeer never list him as a character reference when they're looking for steady work the other 364 days of the year. Kringle thinks if he can make Doris believe in him, and I think more to restore her faith in humanity and to appreciate the importance of imagination rather than to make her believe he's the real drop-through-the-chimney Santa Claus, there's still hope, because, as he says, she's the whole thing in miniature. This implies, and it becomes very clear later at the mental hospital, that Kringle is trying to restore his own faith in humanity as much as anyone else's. What makes the whole story work is that he's not perfect, and that holding to his ideals is hard. Again, he reminds me of Captain America. In every Marvel Cinematic Universe film Steve Rogers has appeared in to date, his character arc is all about sticking to his guns and not taking opportunities for change that would compromise his strict moral code. And he's sympathetic and endearing because we see his human struggle. The faith message isn't watered down or eye-roll inducing because the very man everyone comes to have faith in by the end has massive doubts himself. When he's thrown into Bellevue, what is it with asylums with Bell in their names? Metropolis has Belle Reve and Smallville. Anyway, Kringle answers all the psych evaluation questions wrong deliberately, so he'll be institutionalized, giving in to Sawyer and everyone else who thinks he's a nut job, because he thinks he's failed and the world is too far gone for Santa Claus to change it. He starts to become what he most hates, self-defeatist. It's the most important scene in the movie, because it's the reason I most want him to beat the sanity trial and to be declared Santa Claus. He demonstrates how easy it is to give in to social pressures and to see man-made social constructs as impenetrable steel doors, and how difficult it is to ignore that and to, as Angel says in my favorite quote from that series, live in the world as it should be to show it what it can be. Gailey tells Kringle that Doris didn't sign off on his being thrown in the loony bin as he believed, and reminds him how much he's done for the world already. And that's no exaggeration, the world, given that his goodwill policy to put what the customer wants above store profits has been put into practice at every Macy's store across the country and at all of its fiercest competitor stores, Gimbel's. So after a moment of understandable weakness, that impressively doesn't make me think any less of the man, but instead serves to further legitimize the fiction, Kringle comes to his senses and springs back into action. But now he has a problem. He screwed himself by answering the lucidity questions wrong. That's the other thing I love about this scene. The trial, which easily could have been contrived and seemed to come out of nowhere for the sake of a dramatic third act, is a direct consequence of Kringle's self-doubt. When he goes against his own philosophy, he immediately pays a price for it. Of course, he's vindicated in the end when the state of New York rules that he is unequivocally the one and only Santa Claus on what has to be one of the cleverest legal technicalities in movie history. When the post office receives a letter addressed to Santa Claus at the courthouse, one of the postal workers comes up with the brilliant notion to send the hundreds of letters kids send to the post office addressed to Santa to the courthouse just to get rid of them. And because it's a federal crime for the post office to intentionally send mail to the wrong party, Gailey uses that as proof that the federal government has already declared Kringle the real Santa Claus, and the case is dismissed. By the way, the Postal Service seems way more efficient than it has been in my experience. And I can't help but wonder if that was just an exaggeration or if it really was that much of a well-oiled machine in 1947. I love the logic here. It seems totally absurd, and yet in a day and age where I feel like I've heard everything and I don't know that anything can surprise me anymore, it watches as almost totally plausible. This story is expertly plotted. Things don't just happen because the screenwriters want them to, it's a logical series of actions and consequences, setups and payoffs. Ironically and smartly, there are no real miracles in the film. Even the ambiguous ending, where Susan gets what she's always wanted, a reward she thinks for continuing to believe in Kris Kringle, even though it doesn't make any sense to her, seems to be Kringle setting Doris and Gailey up to help create a miracle for her, rather than Kringle doing anything supernatural. As far as we can tell, Kringle might have just walked into that house and put his cane there, and then he just sent the three of them past it with the driving directions he gives them under the pretense of avoiding traffic. Or it could have been a lot more elaborate than that, I don't know. I love that he manages to give Susan what she wants without really doing it himself. He sets up Gailey and Doris, who are falling for each other now, the perfect opportunity to give Susan the childhood she deserves. But it's ultimately up to them to go through with it. In that way, he is exactly like Santa Claus, which is to say, the made-up one we tell our kids stories about. It's really the parents who create magic for their kids on Christmas morning, and Santa is just the device we use to keep their minds open to possibilities. So everything Kringle does is a perceived miracle because of social expectations. Nobody would think Macy and Gimbel could be made to cordially shake hands, or that Doris would become less cynical, or that the state of New York would officially declare Kringle the real Santa Claus. But I buy all of it. The one thing that seems like an actual miracle, and by that I mean a plot convenience, is the bright idea the postal worker has to send all that mail to the courthouse. After all, if that guy hadn't thought of that, Gailey would have no case and Kringle would be carted back off to the loony bin. Although I still think there might have been a happy ending. The prosecutor and the judge would have both been professionally hanged for committing Santa Claus, and there would probably be such an uproar that the public would force a reversal of the ruling, which would still have proven the good nature Kringle has brought out of people, but something like that would have been a far less impactful and memorable ending. I mean, those men bringing bag after bag of letters to the door is the sort of slapstick that's only funny in the perfect context, and I laughed out loud with a theater full of people almost 60 years after the movie's release. Hey, Howard the Duck! That's what real comedy looks like. But while it's lucky the mail guy saw that letter and it was sent the night before Gailey had to pull a rabbit out of his hat, it's still a development that couldn't have happened without the unwitting intercession of one of our protagonists. Susan writes a letter telling Kringle she believes in him finally, and Doris signs it too. I think the impact Kringle had on her daughter has a lot to do with her change of heart and how much she comes to care about Kringle, and that's the letter the postal worker sees. So while it's probably the most convenient development development, it's plausible, especially since someone in that mailroom had 3 chances to notice where those letters were going and possibly come up with that whole scheme. And I like that it's the direct result of a major turning point for one of our principal characters. Another of the film's central themes is emulation, and I love how thoroughly that's explored. I talk a lot about identity and masks, of course, in Superhero Rewind. You've got characters like Spider-Man, who hide behind a mask and are more comfortable while pretending to be someone else. But at the end of the day, he's Peter Parker in the guise of Spider-Man. Whereas Bruce Wayne conditions himself to become Batman, and he's not really himself except when he's wearing the mask. I imagine Kringle is oddly something closer to Batman, a man who throws himself so completely into a role that it's impossible to tell where the man begins and the persona ends. The only difference is that Kringle probably didn't create the Santa Claus persona. The movie asks the question, when is it okay to imitate someone else, and when is it unhealthy? And at what point do you move from pretending to becoming? And the broader question, how much of living is discovering who you are, and how much of it is becoming who you want to be? It examines this idea through 3 characters who have artificial personas. Kringle, who it presents as sane and an example to be followed, Sawyer, who is presented as a fraud and a menace, and the janitor, a 17-year-old kid named Alfred, who's in the middle, someone who wants to emulate Santa Claus, isn't really the Santa that Kringle is, but is impressionable, gullible, and is easily swayed by Kringle on one side and Sawyer on the other to be the best or the worst version of himself. Kringle values the truth, but there's doubt that he's actually telling the truth. If he's not the real Santa Claus, isn't he as much of a liar as the fake psychiatrist? But then if people want to believe Kringle is Santa despite common sense, and his motivation behind it is as good and altruistic as it seems, then perhaps it's simply a matter of how you define Santa Claus. That's a fictional character, a myth in an institution that's evolved over centuries and contributed to by a number of cultures. Just as it's hard to imagine that anyone could be as motivated or convicted or well-trained as Batman, it's hard to imagine someone like this Kris Kringle could exist. They both make themselves real, sort of like the way fictional characters become real to people when we're invested in them. It isn't a matter of a man deceiving people into thinking what he says is the truth, but rather people coming together to make a socially constructed idea of physical manifestation. Kris Kringle is Santa Claus because people decide he is. There's a definition determined by people collectively, just like there is for what a psychiatrist is. Kringle seems to have the credentials. Society also collectively defines what a real psychiatrist is. And the difference between Kringle and Sawyer is that Sawyer doesn't have the creds. It's not enough that Kringle keeps insisting he's Santa Claus, he keeps proving it through his actions, while Sawyer keeps insisting he's a mental health professional, and he keeps discrediting himself at every turn. As I discussed earlier, this is a movie about the human condition. Kringle is as selfless as they come, yet he still wants something for himself. The joy he gains from bringing other people joy. A repeated idea that comes from the various forms of emulation throughout the movie is that people pretend because it makes them feel important. Kringle himself never says that, of course, because he insists he's really Santa Claus, but he beams when Alfred says he enjoys being a volunteer Santa Claus for just that reason. It makes him feel important. Yet Sawyer pretends to be a mental health professional for exactly the same reason, and Kringle sees him as a viper. Importantly, it's Sawyer's idiotic diagnosis of Alfred, dreaming up whatever insecurities and Freudian issues come to mind just to bolster his own sense of self-worth, that drives Kringle to the physical violence Sawyer earlier insisted Kringle would display. He called it latent maniacal tendencies. But of course, he instigated it and then lied about it, claiming Kringle hit him in the head because Sawyer questioned his identity. Again, I like that there are consequences for Kringle's actions. He never would have gone to the institution if he hadn't bopped Sawyer with his cane, and while the audience probably sides with the movie that Sawyer is an awful person, it's not condoning this violence, and yet it's hard to blame Kringle's contempt for the man who is a perfect foil for him. I think the idea here is that wanting to feel important isn't an evil motivation all by itself. If you do something that really is important and worthwhile, and you're incentivized because you like how it makes you feel, that's not the same thing as feeling important at the expense of others. What Sawyer does not only isn't important, it's destructive, and so the only person who benefits is him, and even he doesn't benefit in the long run. Sawyer reminds me of the elderly neighbor who lives next door to Jessica Jones' parents' old house and makes up awful stories about her dead parents for that exact reason. It makes her feel important. Sawyer goes after Kringle not because he really thinks he's mentally unstable, but because he sees Kringle's confidence and his perceived self-worth as a threat to him. I don't think Sawyer likes that people are buying this guy as Kris Kringle and allowing him to get away with that persona, when he's totally self-conscious, has visible nervous tics, and acts like a time bomb waiting to explode. Kringle is all about making good things happen by changing public perception. Sawyer is about preying on that for his own selfish ends, and represents the furthest extreme of the problem Kringle is trying to combat. He's sort of Santa Claus's arch nemesis, and I like that he challenges Kringle's resolve and gets under his skin, and that he's directly responsible for getting him thrown in the institution. Sawyer's machinations lead to Kringle making the fatal mistake that gets him put on trial, and like with the best superheroes, he serves as the other side of the coin to remind Kringle what he's fighting for. I very nearly could have gotten away with reviewing this on Superhero Rewind, I think, but then I'd be opening a giant Santa bag of worms and put myself in a position where people would expect me to review every Santa Claus movie ever made, and I'm not sure how much of that I could take. Yeah, Santa Claus Rewind. Miracle on 34th Street holds up fantastically. It remains poignant, thought-provoking, and still generates, at least for me, a lot of the laughs I imagine it got in 1947. I'm giving it a 4 out of 4. And join me over on Superhero Rewind soon for a look at another Christmas time favorite released in the summer, The Dark Knight Rises.